Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Majorité requise pour l'adoption de la motion de censure 288. Pour l'adoption 331. La majorité requise étant atteinte, la première motion...
Michel Barnier has been brought down by a parliamentary vote. The first time that a French Prime Minister has been brought down by a parliamentary vote in this country since 1962.
Welcome to the City of London.
The City of London.
The next station is Bank. Please mind the gap between the train and the platform.
The financial heart of the country.
The City.
The City.
Welcome to In the City.
Stand clear of the doors, please.
I'm Allegra Stratton.
And I'm David Merritt, this week from New York.
And Dave, Fran is exactly where you'd expect her to be this morning. She's in Paris, on the ground, covering the French election crisis.
Absolutely. Emmanuel Macron, as we tape this on Thursday, he's looking for a new prime minister after the government was toppled, after the far-right forces there, Marine Le Pen joined with the left to push through a no-confidence motion over a budget dispute.
Yeah, so now Macron is needing to find a new prime minister who can pass the 2025 budget, but that is no easy task given the economic problems facing France. The country is struggling with high debt and a widening deficit, challenges that have been compounded by 2 years of flat growth.
So the future of France and the economic fallout of this political crisis are going to dominate our conversation this week.
Yep, Dave. And although we don't have Fran with us, we are lucky enough to have Adam Posen in the London studio opposite me right now, where Fran normally sits. Adam is president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And over his career, he's contributed to research and public policy regarding monetary and fiscal policies in the G20 and the challenges of European integration since the adoption of the euro. He's also been involved in developing new approaches to financial recovery. So all incredibly on point, Adam. Just to sort of leap straight into the events in France. Okay, yeah, Macron's lost a prime minister. How easy to find a new prime minister that can get this stuff through?
Doesn't matter who the prime minister is at this point, Allegra, but thanks to you and David for having me. What matters is the underlying division in the parliament, that they've got 3 blocks, and unless the moderate part of the left joins the center block, which seems very unlikely, he can make, Brigitte Bardot as prime minister, and it's not going to solve the problem.
We're in an impasse in France. What can happen next? I mean, there have been calls, been going on for some time from the Le Pen's party for Macron to resign, prompting early elections. That seems unlikely. But how long can France limp on without a functioning government?
Well, let's not forget their neighbor Belgium limped on without a functioning government for a couple of years. France is a little more complicated and has a bigger role in the world, but it could easily limp on till the summer or even till September, when I gather by then the election would have to come. The real issue is they have, similar to what in the U.S. we call continuing resolution, they have a provision that the core parts of the government budget can be funded without making decisions on more discretionary parts or long-term budget issues. And so basically, whoever's prime minister, the goal is to get that over the line and then work from there.
So what do you think, Adam, Macron will be thinking right now? But given what you've just said, will he be thinking, actually, I don't need a big charismatic Barnier figure. This is almost an impossible ask. I'm just going to get a kind of place man or woman in.
I don't presume to think the way he does, but I assume he's going to be desperately trying to find someone who he somehow could peel off some votes and get a fresh start, or considering whether if he brought in somebody from one of the other parties could do that. But I think in the end, yeah, he's just going to hope for punting along. And then also about how to make it clear, in his view, how to make it clear that it's the RN, that it's the Le Pen right-wing party that is at fault for not passing the budget.
Yeah, so I was in Paris a week ago, and when this was all erupting, and the sense then seemed to be, well, Le Pen has got to play her hand carefully here. She doesn't want to be the wrecking ball of the government. She's just got to bide her time. It's a lot of expectations that the Élysée Palace is within her grasp at the next presidential election, which is a few years away. But then she's gone and done it. So she's brought the government down but she's wielding extreme amounts of power. It's almost like she's in charge in France already, isn't it?
She's in charge of blocking and bringing things down. That's true, David. Can she pass anything she wants? No. So, and you didn't mention the sort of elephant in the room for her, which is this upcoming judgment and potential conviction and punishment for misusing European Parliament funds in her party.
The spring of next year.
Although we've seen here in the United States, I mean, you know, we've seen what happens. And to her support base, I mean, if they do make a ruling like that, I mean, is it just going to provoke her supporters?
It may. But I think that just as we saw with South Korea reacting very differently and bravely to their coup attempt in a way the Americans did not to January 6th 4 years ago, you know, France can demonstrate it's a country of laws, not people, and pursue this with her. But I mean, the main reason I was raising it was that may explain part of why she chose to bring things down rather than wait, because she's trying to get some facts on the ground established for her and her party ahead of when that decision is made.
The other elephant in the room is Trump and his tariffs, but let's put that let's shove that elephant to one side for a second and just look more widely at, you've got Germany in difficulty as well, and you have in France a deficit of 6%, which actually is not. In the UK, we've had deficits of 11% and so on. But so you've got this big deficit, you've got flat growth. What actually happens to the French economy in the foreseeable?
Can I pause a second on the economics, Allegra? Because the numbers on the French deficit are bad but not horrifying, right? I mean, again, you can compare to Belgium, you can compare to the US, where we've also got deficits, annual deficits over 6% and debt to GDP ratio in excess of 110%. The issue for France is twofold, that tax rates already in France are well in excess of 50% of GDP. So unlike in the U.S., where even if you include all taxes, you're still under 30% of GDP. So if you had to raise taxes, there's room to do it. In France, there really isn't. So they've got a harder budget constraint. And the related issue is what matters for these kinds of situations is not just the numbers, but the quality of the governance. So you mentioned laughingly the UK, and I just came from an economics meeting here this morning in London. The OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, the processes around the budget are being respected by the current government. Whereas in the French case, you've got various people, including Le Pen, who are potentially undermining the governance of the fiscal system. And so that's when you get into real trouble. So it's these two things that make it more serious for France than the numbers would tell you.
I'd quite like to try and sort of connect some dots with some of the things you just said, Adam. I mean, you mentioned South Korea.
Yep.
That shock news of an attempt to impose military rule, that seems to have been brought about by an inability by the government to pass a budget. In France, we have the government collapsing because of an inability to pass a budget. We know about the rows that go on about the debt ceiling and the level of spending in the United States. Is the economics all around the world telling us the same thing? There's a clash between where countries are finding themselves economically, the balance between tax and spending, and the lack of growth, and then the politics of it. A public who aren't willing to put up with higher taxes, don't want to take the pain that is necessary maybe to get public finances in order. And in Britain, the budget that Rachel Reeves claimed she had to do in order to fix the public finances, whether you agree with that or not, we're having businesses recoiling from it, saying it's a disaster and it's going to tip Britain into recession. So are these the same themes playing out all around the world, and it's just a reflection of where the global economy is at the moment?
That's a really profound insight, David. Good on you. No, seriously.
Going a bit too far, perhaps.
Yeah, but no. But I do think it is a common theme. It is a meaningful common theme that you have a bunch of democratic governments in high-income economies who are to varying degrees on the wrong side of demographics, meaning it's harder and harder to pay pensions and keep pensions up with inflation because you have a smaller workforce relative to the number of retirees. You have a more divided polity, maybe not society, but you have a more divided set of party systems. So it's much harder to get compromise or cross-party agreement, which is what you need for either large budget adjustments or tax increases. Nobody wants to be the only party that does it. And to be fair to Macron, that's kind of where he and Barnier were. They were trying to put out a responsible budget, and the other parties didn't want to play along. So I agree with you. There are common themes. The economics does vary, as I tried to say, from country to country in terms of their situations, and the politics too. I mean, what we saw in South Korea, that was very heartening was the recoil from the extreme measures was across parties. But I do think you're on to a really important point, that fiscal politics, after years of warning we would get there, after years of occasionally excessive austerity like during the Euro crisis, we're now at the point where, things are starting to matter.
I mean, can I try another pseudo-profound point, which is that is this also these sort of extreme measures, South Korea, the wrecking ball approach in France, is this the Trumpiverse? Is Donald Trump's world? I think people seeing some of the appointments that he's making, people are bracing for dramatic outcomes in the United States politically. And is it inspiring a little bit more wild behavior on the governance side in other places in the world?
It's possible. I'm not a political scientist, so I can see that. What I would say is, focusing narrowly on the fiscal issues, we kind of have a perverse godsend in the Trump case, that the Republicans got a majority in both houses of Congress, to most people's surprise. The majority in the House is historically narrow, but nonetheless, in that situation, Trump is incentivized to use the normal processes to get his budget through because his party's in control in both houses. And some people, including some sophisticated observers, say optimistically that might even lead to a more reasonable fiscal policy because there'll be a few moderate senators in the Republican Party, a few moderate House members of the Republican Party who the party can't afford to lose. And so in a vote. And so this may actually ameliorate policy. Whereas I was worried if the Democrats had won a majority in the House of Representatives, the lower house, where tax bills have to start, Trump would try to use extra constitutional, non-constitutional means to get around them. So it may be that, notwithstanding the example you raise, that actually Trump's first budget at least may go much more smoothly than some of these others.
But can you crystal ball gaze for us for a second? Where does this end for Europe? I mean, yesterday, Ken Griffin said in an event in New York, Europe is disappearing. To your point earlier about birth rates and demographics and so on, but also the gnarly politics we're looking at right now. Where does this end? As you say, we have Macron trying to do the sensible thing. Whatever you think about the Rachel Reeves budget in the UK as well, she was trying to raise more revenue. What next?
Oh, it's, again, really good and depressing question. I mean,
here for it.
That's the vibe.
Yeah, no, exactly. But we'll try to cheer up between now and year end. I think, Allegra, the future for Europe isn't totally driven by demographics. I mean, there is room to increase female labor force participation like Womenomics did in Japan and some countries, particularly Italy. There is room to increase immigration that's not driven solely by refugees. You know, there are incentives still for early retirement in a lot of countries, some of which all these have popular backlash. But as we've seen with Japan, for example, sometimes you can change things. So I wouldn't go that far. But I do think, and this, of course, is why the Draghi report was so important and was referenced by everyone, I do think recognizing that Europe has a productivity growth problem, has a fiscal problem, and politics, as usual, seems to be breaking down. I think that has to be acknowledged. And Macron, without getting too starry-eyed about it, and when he first came in, I mean, I think there was the hope that he was the renewal of the centrist technocrats, and his effectively political failure does worsen the outlook in that sense. Yeah,
because Macron was the person, or the most prominent leader, hasn't he been, to say what you just pointed to, that, you know, Europe has a productivity problem, that, you know, it needs to become more dynamic as an economy, and he tried to push these measures through. But I mean, the headline on Bloomberg yesterday was, I think it was something like Macron's grand vision in tatters. You know, it's been completely rejected by the public, and the politics has completely foxed him, right?
I mean, you look at the recent history of Europe, and, you know, Gerhard Schroeder, who sold his soul to Putin and Russian natural gas, when he was in, though, did labor market reforms and other reforms in Germany that Angela Merkel and Germany benefited from for the following 15, 20 years, where unemployment got to much lower levels in Germany, even with immigrants coming in, than had ever been in the post-war period. And Gordon Brown, who I worked for and was appointed to the Bank of England by in the UK, tried very hard to do public investment and changes. Again, there were good things, there were bad things, but broadly was trying to do technocratic best, and some of those things paid off, but they still were not rewarded. And without being too cute about it, you can argue that to some degree the Biden folks, there I think the record's frankly much more mixed, and they did a lot of things that I publicly disagreed with. But in the end, they delivered what seemed like pretty reasonable economic performance and still got punished at the polls. So either it's the economics doesn't matter to people, which is possible. People can vote on, as with Brexit, you can vote on something that's totally non-economic. I mean, has economic implications, but your reason for voting has nothing to do with economics. Or there's a very fundamental information communications issue about what people can realistically expect.
Politicians just have shorter and shorter windows, don't they, to do anything? I mean, in Britain, of course, we had this new government came in, at least on paper, with a huge majority. They're enormously unpopular.
Yeah.
Already.
Yeah, I saw that.
I think as always with these things, it's complicated in that because of the stalled living standards, you have people feeling less well off. So it's sort of how do you cut your economic perception? As we're seeing in a lot of these conversations we're having, that you can argue it was economics that did for Biden. You can also argue he did well with the economy. It's really really complex picture. Just to move, you've taken us, Adam, to America. We are not yet living in a world with an actual President Trump. We're just in the sort of phony war before it starts. We all expect tariffs. He's told us to expect tariffs. Just talk us through how you see tariffs being imposed on European trade.
Well, I've been saying for a while that I thought he was going to do big tariffs up front on China and Mexico. And the China was not a surprise, but Mexico people didn't grasp what I thought was going to happen. And he did it even faster in terms of getting out his tweet or Truth Social Elite or whatever it is than I expected. But, Mexico, it's part of a longstanding U.S. abuse of its neighbor, and it's about making an example of Mexico so that others will be scared and pandering to certain political things in the U.S. Anyway, so the upshot of that is I think Europe, frankly, has less to fear by far. I think the asks that Trump is going to have for allies, whether it's Europe, the UK, Japan, Korea, it's basically 5 asks. He's going to say, please spend more on defense. Fine. He's going to say, please spend most of the defense money on U.S. weapon systems, which, frankly, in the short term, you have to do anyway. Fine. Buy more natural gas from the U.S. Well, the problem is the U.S. isn't going to have that much more to export for a while, but anyway, you sign up. Fine. Make some very flashy foreign direct investment in U.S. manufacturing that he can take credit for. I don't know why he's rejecting Nippon Steel, but again, fine. And then the 5th one, that's the sticky one, is sign on the dotted line to restrict certain kinds of technology trade with China. And that's the one that's going to be harder for some of the allies to do. But essentially the ask he's going to make is really not that hard for most of these countries. And I mean, this isn't the world I want to live in. This isn't the way the U.S. should be behaving. But if we accept that it's Trump and this is the kind of thing he's going to do, it's not that bad. He's probably going to give the major Western economies a chance to agree to things before he puts on tariffs. It's China and Mexico that are really going to suffer on the tariffs.
I mean, that's a pretty optimistic outlook there. I mean, it's out, the US economy looks in pretty good shape.
Yep.
Jerome Powell talked about that in New York yesterday. So there's a rosier outlook here. So Trump's inheriting this strong economy. The inflation outlook, it looks okay. So with the US powering ahead, does things look a bit brighter all around the world, or is Europe still going to struggle?
Yes, but. So yes, my forecast, and I was ahead of the Fed on this as well, as some of your colleagues like Manus Cranny and Lisa Abramowitz have interviewed me about, that the U.S. was going to power ahead, that the economy wasn't, the labor market weren't as weak, but also that long-term rates on average were going to go up in the U.S. and in the major economies. And this was going to be true whether or not it was Trump or Harris because of some fundamental reasons, but just the general trend of fiscal excess or unpaid for fiscal spending. But if you have Trump passing laws that are passing a budget that is probably going to expand deficits by at least 1.5% of GDP on top of the 6% that Allegra already mentioned that we already got, you're talking about a world in which long-term rates will be high. And when the U.S. 10-year Treasury is high, it affects everybody. And the other thing about all this is even if the tariffs are not on, The developing world is getting totally hammered in this situation. So Mexico's being made an example of, but mostly the very biggest developing economies are emerging markets. Brazil, Mexico, India, Indonesia, Turkey, they're coming out of it okay. And that's good because that's a lot of human beings. But there's also a lot more human beings in the rest of South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Central America, a lot of other human beings out there. And in a world where the U.S. is driving capital flows into the U.S., interest rates are rising in the U.S., and I think the Fed's going to have to raise short rates, in 6 to 9 months anyway. That's a pretty grim outlook for the world as a whole. And then if Trump is undermining, again, Biden didn't do a great job on this by any means, but is further undermining international cooperation, international organizations like the WTO and the IMF, then what happens to the rest of the world gets even worse because there's no response mechanism. So, yeah, U.S. growth is probably going to be pretty good the next couple of years. European growth is going to be mostly driven down by France and Germany, but the U.S. will buoy it some, and it'll be a strong dollar probably, so that'll also help. But world at large, not so good.
How about in Britain? And, we talked about the Reeves budget a little bit. There was a quote that really leapt out at me on Bloomberg this morning. This was news from Fraser's Group. And the CEO told Bloomberg, after cutting their forecast, the skullduggery around the budget is mind-blowing. It's not only just increased cost, it's also destroyed consumer confidence. That's his excuse for cutting the forecast and the shares down a lot. But, is he right? I mean, businesses have been complaining about these measures. We're seeing some of the data come through now that the UK economy is going to really struggle. And is it because of the Reeves budget? And are we heading towards a recession in Britain?
So I used to have to follow this for a living when I was at Bank of England, and I've tried to keep up with the UK. And I actually was surprised the last couple of years that both sterling and UK growth were stronger than I expected them to be. So my sense of the UK is probably off. I think, that being said, I think along with the major international organizations, I doubt you're going to see a recession. But I do think marking up UK growth for the next couple of years, as I guess the OECD just did, is probably unjustified. The fiscal drag is going to be pretty big. The debate, the constructive debate, as opposed to the business whinging around the Reeves budget, I think is twofold beyond what you were saying a few minutes ago, David, about just the general inability of getting the population to pay for things. First is the balance of how much do you invest in the future and borrow to invest in the future versus making sure you can balance the budget now. And I think there's a legitimate pushback that the Chancellor may have overdone the short-term austerity versus if she had set out why she was doing long-term. Second part is just related to that, and it goes back to what Gordon Brown and Labour tried to do 20 years ago, and which is going to be an issue now for France, for Germany, for everybody, is how do you do sort of a capital public investment budget when you have short-term fiscal constraints? Because you have green transition, you have defense, you have real needs to spend.
Can I just add on that, a particularly sort of sharp end of this debate about tariffs and so on, and the kind of uncoupling from China, is if you look at their cheap EVs, and to your point, we've got a debate right now in the UK around how on earth do you support the British car industry and makers. And
there shouldn't be a British car industry and makers.
That's what some people in Whitehall do think. But then you see job losses.
Yeah, but I mean, this.
Should we then have an influx of Chinese cars? Can you see that being?
If the U.S. won't punish you for it, I would think you should, because the
U.S. punish?
Well, that remains to be seen.
And this is the question I'm driving at.
Yeah, no, you were driving many questions, but anyway, I think probably not, as long as they're not exported from Mexico. I don't think the U.S. will punish. They'll view it as the UK as being stupid importing instead of producing. But I think it's like with solar panels, in the end, you save so much money and you make so much environmental progress if you can adopt this technology cheaply by buying from the Chinese. And the amount of value-added jobs you're sacrificing is frankly not that large. Now, again, you can't say that about everything. There's all kinds of high-tech things the UK both can compete in and should not be importing from China. But EVs at this point are just production goods, just like solar panels, just like personal computers. And the US is, I think, foolish to not be importing cheap EVs.
Jolly times on In the City, on the In the City podcast. I think that's probably all we have time for. Thank you very much, Adam Posen, for coming in to see us on your trip to the UK.
Thank you for having me in the city.
Thanks for listening to the In the City podcast from Bloomberg. It was hosted by me, Allegra Stratton, and David Merritt. It was produced by Summer Sardi, production support from Moses Andam, and sound design by Blake Maples. Special thanks to Adam Posen. Please subscribe, rate and review wherever you listen to podcasts.